So the Indiana Pacers not only made it back to the playoffs for the first time in 3 years, they also made a pretty deep run. And yeah, they had a lot of injury luck along the way, and I'm sure the organization is aware of that. But they also probably feel that they have a really good team that has the potential to be really great. And nowadays, when runs like these happen, teams want to be aggressive. They might want to make a big trade or a big signing to further build upon what they just did. So, is there any move like that on the way? And the answer to that is probably not, because they already made that move, mainly by trading for Pascal Siakam in the trade deadline. So, this upcoming offseason for the Pacers will, in all likelihood, be pretty quiet. Most of their resources should be dedicated towards retaining their main players, mainly Pascal Siakam and maybe Obi Toppin. So, in this video, I want to go over their payroll, kind of see some projections of what Pascal Siakam and Obi Toppin could make, and go over some bigger picture ideas for the Pacers in the future. So here's the Pacers payroll so far heading into next season. They are roughly 57 million below the luxury tax line, which should give them plenty of space towards re-signing Pascal Siakam and Obi Toppin. Just important to note that $171.3 million line, the Pacers historically are not taxpayers, so don't expect them to exceed this amount in their payroll. Now, because of their currently low $150 million payroll, they technically could generate about 25 million in cap space. However, you can disregard that. They're not going to be a cap space team. That's because they're going to operate over the cap, so they could re-sign Pascal Siakam and potentially Obi Toppin. Now, since they'll be an over the cap team, they do have some other exceptions they could use, like the non-taxpayer mid-level projected at just under 13 million and the biannual projected at 4.7 million. However, using either of these exceptions would hard cap them to the $178.7 million first apron level. So if they want to use one or even both of these while already having re-signed both Siakam and Toppin, they may need to reduce some payroll first in order to have enough flexibility below the first apron to use them. So now I want to discuss Pascal Siakam and what his next contract could look like, because part of the reasons the Toronto Raptors traded him in the first place was because of what he could command on his next deal. He is going to be probably commanding max level money. And I'm sure the Pacers were prepared to pay him that level of money when they traded 3 first-round picks in the first place to get him. So he's currently extension eligible through June 30th for 2 years, 80 million. But it seems like he's going to pass on that so he can get a higher annual range and more years. So this is the maximum amount he is going to be eligible for with the Pacers. It's for 5 years, starts at 42.3 million, and it's projected at 245 million over 5 years. Now, he might not get that full amount, but I think he'll get pretty close to it. And that's because there could be some teams like the Sixers or Pistons, for example, that are trying to get better, and I could potentially see throwing also max level offers at him. Now I need to discuss Obi Toppin and what he could potentially be looking at on his next deal. He was awesome for the Pacers. Didn't quite work out as a starter, but he came along as a backup after they acquired Pascal Siakam. I would imagine the Pacers would love to have him back. And they probably could keep him, given that most teams that would probably go for him can only offer the mid-level exception, starting at just under 13 million. And the Pacers have his full bird right, so they could easily top those offers. So this is a projection I made. It's kind of on the highest end of what I could see the Pacers wanting to keep him at. Pretty comparable money to what PJ Washington and Grant Williams got last offseason. Now, keep in mind that the Pacers' front court is pretty crowded with Siakam starting, and they've got Jarris Walker in the pipeline. They just selected him with the 7th overall pick last summer. So because of all those variables, I could also very well see him being a sign and trade candidate, especially if the offers for Obi Toppin in free agency exceed this mid-level type money. I want to talk about another player who might not really factor into things for the Pacers this summer, and that is Andrew Nembhard. He's been starting and playing alongside Tyrese Haliburton at the 2, and he's been great. He's going to be extension eligible this summer, and this is the maximum they could give him. This is what it's projected at. They could even start it earlier. They could decline that $2.2 million team option and have him start making that level of money. But I would imagine that if they do extend them, they'd want to start it later and keep paying him that minimum level amount. Now, I don't know if the Pacers extend them this offseason or at all, but I've been wondering a lot about his future with this Pacers core because I could see him being a lead guard in this league elsewhere. And it seems like Benedict Mathurin is the plan for the Pacers at the two. So maybe down the line, maybe Andrew Nembhard could be a trade piece to fill future needs. But whether it is with the Pacers or another team, I could see him getting this level annual salary range on his next contract. So here's a projection for the Pacers offseason as an example to show what it could end up looking like. So I have Pascal Siakam making the max, which is equal to Tyrese Haliburton's max, and they re-sign Obi Toppin to the projected amount I gave. They also guaranteed TJ McConnell's contract, and they added a player with their second round pick. And with all this combined, they get to fill out their roster and finish just at the luxury tax. Now, it's important to note that the Pacers have only paid the luxury tax 5 times in their history and just twice since 2011. So it's possible that they go into the tax in the season, but I think it's much more likely that they get below it if they do initially are above it, and then maybe potentially pay it in a future season if they are like a legitimate contender. So after re-signing Siakam and mostly running things back, they essentially have the choice between re-signing Obi Toppin and using that non-tax payer mid-level exception projected at just under 13 million. And that's because, like I mentioned earlier, using that exception would hard cap them to the $178.7 million first apron level. So they're already going to be pretty close to that amount after re-signing Siakam and either using that exception or re-signing Obi Toppin. So that's why I mentioned that Obi Toppin could be a sign and trade candidate. Whether there's a player they could sign or trade for that they feel they could better round out the roster with, maybe they would choose to reserve that salary slot for such a player elsewhere. So that's what I've got on the Pacers for this upcoming offseason, but I do want to expand a little more on some of the ideas that I mentioned earlier. First, Obi Toppin. If he is signed and traded, I wouldn't expect an exciting return. Most in recent history, most returns in sign and trades for players, it's mostly draft picks and not even great draft picks. It could just be like several seconds. If they do pursue a certain type of player, whether it's for the mid-level exception or in a sign and trade, I would think that they're going to go after a wing. They've been pretty undersized in that regard, other than Aaron Nesmith over the past 2 seasons. They had Buddy Hield and Benedict Mathurin playing higher a lot, and then they traded Buddy Hield and got Doug McDermott back, and he did not really help as much. So they could really use another wing. And if they do pursue one, I wouldn't expect them to pursue an expensive guy. Maybe guys like DeAndre Hunter or Keldon Johnson, some names that could potentially be available this offseason. They could help the Pacers, but making around the $20 million range, that would definitely push the Pacers into the tax. So I could see them going for players more so in like the $10 to $14 million mid-level range. And it's just a couple guys they could potentially pursue with that full amount. Maybe Kelly Oubre or Royce O'Neal, just to name a few. As far as Andrew Nembhard, I am definitely going to be keeping an eye on his situation. He's extension eligible this offseason, but at the same time, there is no rush to give him one. There's still 2 years left on his deal. At the same time, if Benedict Mathurin does develop into the player he's expected to be, I think we could potentially see Andrew Nembhard being a potential trade candidate down the line to fill some future needs. But overall, this is a pretty exciting time to be a Pacers fan. Yeah, there were some questionable losses and inconsistent play throughout the stretch, but it's still really encouraging that even though they had this relatively easy path full of injuries, that this relatively young team was able to really take advantage and win these games that they should. And I doubt the organization will get too carried away with this run that they just had. I'm sure they're going to develop continuity and development, which is why I think it's going to be a relatively quiet off season. And just as long as they focus on those two things, that's the most important thing for them.